we are going to talk about navigating the evolving investment landscape. We have a couple of great capital providers in different realms here. I'm going to introduce myself really quickly, and I'm going to introduce them to keep it snappy so we can get right to the content. You guys might know them already. I will ask you each for a little factoid about yourselves, as I mentioned on the human side. Please be ready to share your go-to dish to bring to Tom Quigley, co-founder and managing director at Superorganism, all the way to my left, to your right. The only VC dedicated to benefiting biodiversity. So just a note, this was a good learning for me, not necessarily harnessing biological systems and processes, but benefiting biodiversity. Superorganism invests in pre-seed and seed companies and is a relatively newer VC firm launching in 2023. And you mentioned that you're finalizing your first fund right now, meaning actively deploying capital, mostly but not exclusively in the US.
Hi, everybody. So my submission to the potluck is that beyond VC, I was originally a conservationist to start my career, and also am a ski instructor, dive instructor, and flying instructor, and freediver, and can pull a breath for 5.5 minutes.
I was expecting a literal potluck dish, but that's better.
Oh, is that what you intended? Sorry.
Yeah.
I will submit. I'll just go straight to dessert and do chocolate chip cookies.
Stonely Blue, managing partner and co-founder at Third Sphere, a venture fund investing in pre-seed and seed stage climate tech companies. Third Sphere is hardware inclined. For those of you who are familiar, invests globally, mostly in developed markets. And Third Sphere has been around since 2013, actively investing out of its fourth fund. So again, flows fundraising. A couple folks here who maybe have interest. Public submission.
When we host events, I tend to order way too much boxed water, so I end up with a bunch of boxed water in my garage. And so when I'm invited to a party or potluck and ordering something, it's just boxes and boxes of boxed water.
Interesting, thanks. Megan Raisle, thank you. Megan Raisle, partnerships at Streamline. Streamline Climate. Debatable. Which some of you may know, a relatively early stage startup which develops AI tools to help you discover, qualify, and apply to government funding opportunities. So this is the non-equity investor or capital provider on our panel today. Megan, of course, is a startup operator, but we'll be asking her here to leverage her insights as kind of an enabler of capital and representing your clients and their quest for resources. Streamline's current customer base is leaning more towards later stage kind of deployment-ready companies who are, for example, bidding on city RFPs and not necessarily looking for R&D grants, but I'll let you do a little bit on that. Do you have a patent submission?
I always have to bring something vegan. I'm really into pepe wheats right now. You can make them quite good. The crispy, people that aren't vegan will eat them if you don't call them wheat. I love him.
Thanks. So Claire Veuthey at Rizoma, a couple of my partners are sitting here in front, Wes and Rob. We are a boutique investment bank with a specialization in climate. We take away a fairly stretchy definition of what climate means. What we can help with is if you're looking for an exit or if you're ready to sell your company or perhaps cap raise, that's stuff we can help you with. So come talk to us if that's the need, or if you just want to know a little bit more about the landscape and what exits look like. My potluck submission, I've developed a mean zucchini bread, which is a way that I get vegetables into my kids. Okay, the audience says there's been a little bit of a mix since we last took an audience poll, so I'd love to hear a little bit of who's in the room. If you can, please raise your hand if you're a founder or startup operator. Okay, the preponderance. An investor. Great, thank you. And who's here to learn, partner, find your next role? All right, great, nice mix, thanks. Okay, we're gonna start with the elephant in the room, which has probably been touched on by almost every panel this week. This new administration has kind of accelerated what we have seen to be a massive chilling effect in this industry. In some cases, we're seeing just a full-on retreat. Can you each share kind of one Xoogler implication that you're seeing for our space?
Well, on the nature side, I think that the first real target was on the backs of climate, but we really are starting to see this come towards the nature and biodiversity side as well. Today's Earth Day, and this may have already happened since I last checked my phone, but there was an expectation that there were going to be executive orders to start doing things like, for example, stripping away nonprofit status from some of the larger grant-making institutions or foundations that were able to, and nature was specifically called out as well in some of the verbiage where previously it might have just been under climate. And so that, where previously we might have said some large family offices or foundations or DAFs or other types of approaches might be good financing opportunities outside of the kind of more traditional VC, as they continue to chip away at some of the, just make life harder across those different types of financing, that a lot of that flexible or catalytic financing in the form of grants or re-granting opportunities for downstream organizations, I think we'll start to get a little thinner on the ice. Now, a lot of this is going to be challenged legally, and we're going to see how much of this can stand. I mean, whether or not you can truly change someone's 501c3 status to be, the essence of your corporation and actually remove some of that tax benefits and others. Will that actually maintain in court over time? It's unclear, but they can certainly make life painful and hard up until that point. So I think that on the nature and biodiversity side, which is where we look at the overlap of climate and nature quite a lot, and there's some things that do overlap significantly, like soils and wildfires and oceans, and other things like infrastructure and grid and EVs or micromobility that sit more on the climate side, and so we pay somewhat less attention to. So the questions around land, what happens with land, questions around, opening national parks and the Bureau of Land Management for ELM areas, for logging and for oil development, for fishing. Also, another thing that happened recently was a large marine protected area in the Pacific was opened for fishing entirely. And so all of those pressures on biodiversity and land and where those kind of overlap with climate, those are really going to start calling a lot of corporate interests into question and see whether some of the commitments to climate and nature that have been made over the last 5 or 10 years are true commitments based on risk and their understanding of their businesses, and that their needs to work to protect their bottom line and their supply chains, or whether they were more kind of easy to make CSR style commitments that now that it's kind of open season, they'll roll back and just kind of quietly start to do more on the exploitation side of things. So all of that is yet to be seen.
So more on the company building side, I think the moment has, and this is a good thing actually, the moment has forced the climate tech industry to become better communicators and more creative communicators. I mean, you hear it even in panels where startups are, for example, like we'll have to figure out how to reemphasize, like, we don't depend on people caring about climate for this to be a sensible, like a good decision to make from purchasing fish market. And I think between that and just having to navigate things like Streamline would help you rewrite grants to dodge the minefields of like alignment with the Trump administration, or even in communicating with investors, because while climate investors are paused for one reason or another, generalist investors are all over the place looking for AI deals and kind of confused about everything else. And so it's like, this is a tougher time, but it might be in the best out of us of like, how do we communicate that we're actually the better, faster, and sometimes an increasingly cheaper option that makes sense to adopt, not just because you care about the planet. I think in this last phase of like Clean Tech 2.0 or whatever, at the peak of the hype cycle, there was a lot of like, yes, of course we should do this. We all love the planet, and I mean, this is a great moment. We're all enthusiastic about climate and all of that. But there was some laziness that introduced of like, you're not getting to the meat of why someone who doesn't care about climate change should buy this. And now that has been forced as a frontline sort of concern. It's great business for folks like Veronique, who help people with their communications and marketing and brand, because this is a time when, a lot of, if not all, climate startups are trying to rethink like how they present themselves to the world in an era where it puts a target on your back for that to be your core message, if not alienates, as Tom mentioned, like a lot of what historically would have been your sort of, it makes sense for this corporate to be a customer because they care about climate. And it turns out as soon as there's a administrative cover, a lot of those commitments are going away. Now, there are still chief sustainability officers. There's still an alignment, again, with the bottom line and sometimes top line. For example, helping them put new products out to market that are actually better for their margins. But now you have to take that extra few steps to find that stakeholder and communicate that common thread or that motivation to buy that isn't just we should do this because the planet needs us to, or future generations need us to, which is still true. But I think it's important that we do evolve and mature. And I'm frankly glad to see it happening, even though the pressure is on and it's tough. I think founders are rising to the occasion.
Yeah, I'd echo pretty much everything Stanley said. I think that's been our journey over the last 8 to 9 months, is like figuring out how to communicate with both our existing customers and a whole new world of customers that we can work with outside of this like direct climate space. I'd say a really unfortunate but exciting silver lining if you're hiring is that there are a lot of really overqualified, wonderful people leaving DOE and EPA and DOT, and they're excited to do really good work in the private sector. And yeah, they're ready to work with us in the private world for sure.
Thanks. On that, and we started touching on this a little bit. What's the best pivot that you've seen a company do in terms of the changing backdrop?
Well, this is funny because it's been a little bit in process for a minute, and it has just been timed with this realization as the new administration comes in. But one of the companies that we support, and also Juliet Sway is a portfolio founder as well. I said if you heard her amazing talk just then, that's a great example of the kinds of companies that we like to support. Another company is another materials company that makes luxury leather out of invasive species. And so they work to replace the exotic leathers of groups like Gabrielle Hearst or Tory Burch. I'm not a very fashionable person, so I had to be told who Gabrielle Hearst was. But she designed Jill Biden's dress for the inauguration in 2021 as a really risen star, I suppose, in the fashion world. And so they replaced their exotic leathers with things like Burmese python, which is invasive in the Everglades. And since it was introduced 20 or 25 years ago, the populations of bobcat, possum, and raccoon all declined by about 95% each. So every individual snake that you can get out of the Everglades is, an incredible boon for all of the animals that would have eaten for the rest of its life. And so a single, garment made from python leather can be extremely regenerative, beyond just the impact of the leather that it's replacing. And so their initial hypothesis when they went out was to say, we'll work with the fashion brands, and then, they will buy the leather, and that's going to be our main revenue driver. That as they continued to work with both sides of the supply chain, they really found that, and particularly in red states even, they're seeing the most traction. There were departments of the interior and groups that were actually doing the invasives removal that they had money, but they hadn't really, nobody's been building tech for these groups, right? To coordinate between the many hunters that they have out in the field and fishers, to be able to plan and coordinate offtake and then movement to the leather processors, and then like doing all of that stuff to get between Balenciaga and, Mississippi is just nobody was building those supply chains before. And so they realized that actually there's an awful lot of excitement and interest within these state governments, and particularly in red states, a really willingness to work with these types of technologies. And so they are still very much building those types of leathers and working with those luxury providers. But they've really shifted into thinking about how do we build and structure supply chains to work with these state agencies that have the capital and are really happy to spend it and excited that somebody is paying attention to their problem now and are continuously winning grants on not grants, big customer buys in these states, and once they land it for one species, then they can start building out sideways into other species that they still have problems with there as well. So I think that the new administration and just the interest, kind of continued and growing interest actually in the red states, led to that pivot, but also just being able to increase their total margin by getting paid on both sides of the supply chain has really led to that innovative pivot.
I'd say the most impressive pivot that we've seen in our portfolio, and this is actually a model I think can and should be copied across the climate tech industry. It's a company called Cove. They were called Cove Tool before. They develop software for designing buildings for a better climate positivity and comfort. And the pivot, they actually are taking advantage of two things that are coalescing. One is that point that I made earlier that, the sort of fair weather friends are going away, or people who were never truly aligned on climate but were doing it because they thought they had to are now wavering. And it's, it's frankly, it's not that they're bad people, it's that they're confused. They don't realize that this actually is the way. And that's an opportunity, because that means that a lot of the energy transition that was happening and that should continue to happen is not happening at the pace that it should. And that's a bad thing on one hand, but on the other hand, it means that the thing that is supposed to be happening for a lot of reasons beyond just the planet wanting it and needing it to happen, there are people who are dropping the ball and they're missing this opportunity. They're not rising to the moment. So all that is to say, that's one forcing function of like, this is in the case of Cove, is architects and architecture firms who were adopting Cove software because, their clients wanted climate positive buildings, etc. And now they're like, well, people don't care about climate as much anymore. So they're not as motivated to buy on that prompt. This was the problem that, to the credit of the co-founders, they saw the early indications of it way early, just even in that first, sort of early waves of like, what if Trump becomes president and, there's less of an emphasis on climate. And if you were really looking, you could already see that, the wafering starting just even at the beginning of the election cycle. And they saw that, they're like, we're making a good amount of money and we're growing, and we need to start thinking up like ahead of the wall if we want to keep this party going. And so that's, again, all that overture is that's the first side. Recognizing the opportunity in your industry where your customers are being dumb, frankly. And so when a customer is being dumb, it might be time to consider becoming their competitor instead. And so long story short, the other dynamic that's coalescing here is AI. And what AI will, there's a lot we could say about AI, but the one key thing that is absolutely true is it helps you move faster. It helps you execute more volume. And what that means as an entrepreneur is it helps you enter new markets, build new things faster. And that includes competing with traditional industries. And so your competitors are not going to move as fast, or traditional industries may or may not, depending on the industry, depending on the structure, culture, whatever, may or may not move as fast with AI, but a new entrant adopting AI first could. And so you take that two combination, the ignorance of like missing the opportunity in the moment with climate technologies, and now the ability to show up as a competitor. And so Cove, to make it too long of a story, a little less long, Cove went from selling software to architects to becoming an architecture firm that's AI first, climate first. They get to control the messaging. They get to go after the customers on this is going to be a better, faster, cheaper, more comfortable building. You can curate the messaging around the climate part depending on who the customer is. And that side of the business is already outpaced their already successful SaaS business. And it's because their customers on the SaaS side started dropping the ball. And so I think, again, that's a replicable pattern. And, I think qualifies as a masterful pivot.
I can talk a little bit about what we've done at Streamline. So when we started a little over 3 years ago now, our bread and butter really was federal funding. We helped a lot of startups, a lot of larger companies apply for these massive federal grants and loans. Obviously, that's been completely decimated. And we knew that was going to happen, and we started preparing for it. And a lot of what we've done now is support people with city RFPs, with utility RFPs, with RFPs in the AEC space, because there are millions of competitive, complicated solicitations that take companies and grant writers and proposal writers hundreds of hours. And that's really where we've moved. And just to speak a little bit to your point, something about becoming the competitor to your customer. I think when we first started, we're an AI native company. AI was a really scary thing, and people were very, very scared of using our tool. And now it's become, well, if you don't use it, someone else is. So you're just going to fall behind. And that's really where we've shifted our messaging to. Obviously, in some sectors, we no longer go by Streamline Climate, we go by Streamline, because that's really our goal, is to help organizations find and identify funding faster. And if they're not interested in the climate part, that's okay.
I was for the record, I was going to say Streamline. But I knew that would likely be her answer. I didn't want to steal the thunder. Yeah.
So a kind of two-sided question, and maybe we can start with you, Stonely, this time. What growth areas are you seeing, and then what do you wish folks were working on more? So where you're seeing more heat, and has it created a new area of focus for you, but then, where is there a gap where you feel like there's...
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone can agree that the fires, SoCal fires earlier this year, reignited, no pun intended, I think the awareness and the enthusiasm around addressing fire risk and, the challenges around both identifying, suppressing, preventing fires, but also it brought back top of mind the correlation of industry and property risk and climate. It's the one stubborn truth about climate that is hard to refute. And people still will try to refute it. They'll be like, oh, there's people lighting the fires or whatever. But you do the math and the increase of the frequency and the intensity, and that it's beyond just fire. It's also weather events of other kinds that are increasing in frequency and tendency. And so resilience is seeing its moment, which I feel like it was the redheaded stepchild, in climate tech. Again, there's so much to talk about regarding mitigation, renewables, etc., that we barely spoke about as an industry, barely spoke about resilience and adaptation. In some cases, it was like a bad word. Are we giving up? Are we accepting defeat? Why are we talking about adapting? But the reality is the ship literally sailed 10, 15 years ago. And now it is a matter of adjusting course, but also we have to adjust to the new realities of the direction that we've set ourselves on. I'll keep it short. We won't talk about targets and RISNIM and all that. But because those things are out there, people don't understand that. The common person doesn't understand 1.5, 2, 3, points per, whatever, how much CO2 concentration, all those things. But they do understand whether or not their house is more likely to burn down, or whether or not they're more likely to get in a tornado or hurricane or whatever, right? And that has brought a lot more enthusiasm and energy and talent to the resilience side of the climate dynamic. So, yeah.
Megan, have you seen any sort of new areas of activity among your client base?
Certainly. I mean, like I mentioned, a lot of our older clients are folks that were purely getting funding from the federal space, or that was large portions of their business and their R&D. A lot of them are pivoting to find partnerships in the corporate space. And it's really about making that case that this is a good business decision for you, regardless of the climate impact. I think Bolt was a really good example of that, more on the consumer side. But some of our folks in hard tech that sell more to commercial industry have definitely been doing that. And then just to, maybe not to harp on AI, but to speak a little bit more about a lot of the advances in LLMs, I think if you're building a software company, it's really easy to get started now. So if you have an idea and you're interested in testing it, you can do it in a couple weeks now, right? And that's really exciting to just test what's going to work and get started and move on if it's on.
I'm going to be a little obvious and say, on the kind of 5-year scale, biodiversity, I feel like we really just didn't have this in the conversation. Even when we started raising the fund back in 2022, we were talking to some people and they would say oh, that's nice. I don't know what that means. And then 6 months later, we would talk about it and they would go, reach out to us for a conversation and then go, I don't know how you'll, your timing was crazy, because I've had 6 clients come to me and ask about biodiversity and what have you seen here in the last 6 months since we talked last? And so they're just happen to be, sometimes it's better to be lucky than smart, right? And so we ended up starting our process right when this was also starting to enter the conversation, and a lot of the, okay, we're doing the climate thing, and what? And next? So starting to get ready and kind of what climate tech did over the last 10 years is kind of shifted the Overton window to be able now for people to start thinking about biodiversity as well and what that means and kind of embrace the complexity. Of course, in the last year, I mean, really since the new administration, there's a little bit more, I feel, hunkered down mode a little bit. And the thing that I'm seeing as a growth area that I'm really pleased that a lot of the people in the nature and biodiversity space in particular are starting to talk about is risk, and talking about why it makes sense for people to have high levels of exposure within their supply chains or their value chains and their businesses. Why does it make sense to make this argument to them, not as like a CSR, like nature is nice, you should care about it sense, but core risk to your business in terms of wildfires, mudslides, coastal erosion, watersheds, all of that, the ecosystem services, and understanding and helping those companies understand why there are either high levels of risk or large opportunities for them to be understanding better what they can do with their land and their supply chains and value chains. So that's been a really exciting opportunity. I think also stacked with, like you said, with the AI and kind of LLM side of things, where people can start pulling more signal from all of the new wave of data that we have on nature, environmental data, and biodiversity, and reason across it and pull out some key insights to serve very clear customer needs. That's all a really exciting area that I see right now. The one thing that I would still love to see more of in the nature space, or and in climate as well, is, well, no, more on the nature space. I think that when people talk about nature tech, there's still kind of a consideration that it's like MRV. It's like biodiversity MRV. And that would be like saying that the opportunity set in climate tech is MRV and accounting softwares. And we know that that's not true, right? And so the opportunity set in biodiversity is really similar to climate tech across all industries, as long as you're, using technology or new approaches and creating value, and also reducing the drivers of biodiversity loss. And there are many, many ways to do that, like the invasive species leather example, or companies like Sway, many of the founders in this room. But right now, that's still not quite being thought of or captured under nature tech, and it feels like there's still kind of a, is it monitoring? Is it geospatial? Is it, it's monitoring biodiversity is the opportunity. We see it as much, much larger, and that's where we would love to just push the whole attention towards as well.
One last question from me, and I think we'll have a time for one or two from you all, so get ready. Just in the face of this uncertainty, right, which is really our kind of what we're seeing as a consistent takeaway of the administration change, is like folks don't know, so it's blocking up decisions and blocking up investment in a lot of risk taking. Can you talk a little bit about how you're partnering with your portcos or your clients to help them stabilize?
I think I talked about this a little bit, but people are looking for other sources of funding. So we have a lot of people coming to us, they're like, where should I look? It's really great if you meet grants in your business in blue state, because there's still funding coming out of New York, Illinois, Massachusetts, California. That's wonderful. But then a lot of people are pivoting to other sectors. We work with a lot of consultancies that work on behalf of clients, and they're expanding outside of their normal reach, right? They're going to look for money in the ag space. They're going to look for money in the health space, spaces that are a little safer. And then also the DoD has been a huge source of funding. There's a lot of climate work happening in really different terms in the DoD, and if you can talk about it differently, that there's a lot of opportunity there as well.
And this kind of maps back to what we were saying in terms of not rebranding, but changing the language a little bit, and climate turning into resiliency, kind of American dynamism of all of those can bleed into each other in a way that I think has been slowly happening.
I think the general advice, it's not the easiest thing to hear, but assume that VC as we knew it is done. It may not be true, but in the current moment, I think for two reasons, demands that we sort of assume Maglon. We can't just sit around waiting. VC was never going to help us all solve climate in a silo, right? It was always going to be about diverse capital, et cetera. And in this moment in particular, there's a lot of confusion in the VC industry. It was our deals all, are the only interesting deals ever going to be $10 million, $50 million seed rounds in AI. And that's, and people have to raise $1 billion funds to be able to play that game. Maybe not necessarily true, but certainly after seed, where you're still seeing activity, it is a bloodbath trying to raise like a bridge or a series A. And yes, you can get it done eventually, right? If you're willing to do the work, spend the time, etc. But you're actually putting your company at risk of like dying at the vine, trying to convince VCs one thing or another, whatever. Like, and the second thing to keep in mind though is that one thing that will be true, there will always be capital for fast growth and revenue and new market sort of capture. And that, we'll see what that manifests. It's a reversion back to traditional VC, great, or if it's a emergence of other, international markets of VC that do the more traditional VC thing and like how actually fund companies do reasonable, creation targets, etc. That's great. But, the thing that you can control you can't control what's going to happen in an industry, especially a relatively nascent new industry like venture, right? But what you can control is your growth, your revenue. The path to that may not look like what you read in some startup book or saw in some movie. It might mean being as lean as possible, leveraging AI as much as possible. But frankly, that's what VCs, if anything, that's what VCs are looking for right now. How much more can you get done with 10 people than a company that already raised too much money and now has 100 people? Can you go faster than them? That's frankly going to be one of the bars that you have to meet anyway. So you should be asking yourself, what more can we be doing? How can we 10x without any more additional capital? Like, where can we be more efficient? Where can we apply more tools to go faster, to generate growth, to generate, how do we go all out on generating revenue and assume we're not ever going to raise money again? Like, how do we go all out on bringing revenue in? And that might include a side product, a side quest that brings in capital, like self-funding. Again, not the most fun thing to hear, especially from a VC, speaking against myself and Tom here. But the reality is, like, once I'm in as an investor in your company, I'm on your side, right? Like, now how do we protect this and help it really truly grow to what it can and should be, versus like how we throw this egg out there and see what VCs want to swing a bat at it and, potentially just crack it in the process. And so that's our advice, is like default alive. I mean, it's not necessarily that novel, like get to default alive, right? And then let the VCs come to you, like whatever version of VC emerges out of this weird season. Easier said than done, sure, but easier than trying to figure out how to convince VCs that you're 2-3x growth and a market that you've proven makes sense to them, because they're expecting 100x growth in AI specifically, and everything else looks weird to them right now. So good luck doing that, right? Versus figure out your customers, figure out your product, figure out your costs of doing business, get lean on everything, focus on your own growth, and then see what VCs are smart enough to recognize that you're out of rocket shit and they may miss out.
I agree with a ton of that. I really feel like we're moving into a haves and have-nots world where you're going to see these big, huge rounds get stomped out where everybody is trying to get into them. And then, that's going to seem very unfamiliar to a lot of other founders that are going out there and knocking on doors and not getting answers. And so, another thing that we're seeding is this idea of seed strapping, where people are raising their seed round and bringing it as large as possible, and then keeping their belts tight, not overexpanding, using the new, AI and vibe coding tools to just go as far as you can and bring in that revenue. And if you can't ever raise that next round, then almost all the better. And so I think that when you're looking at partnerships and, if you're thinking about that first round or first few rounds, it increases the importance of either having investors or an advisory relationships with operators, former founders, and people really that did it, themselves and had were up to their knees in the muck. Having those people to be able to think creatively around how do you run your business in many ways, almost more like a bootstrapped founder, when they're like Peter Levels on Twitter is a fascinating follow, because that guy launches new businesses and then kills them off like 30, 40 times a year sometimes. And he's, builds a new multi-million-dollar business kind of each year on some random thing that is picked up with his audience, and it's just him. And so, that whole community of bootstrappers and kind of like the OG digital nomad community, almost being able to tap into some of that scrappiness, ruggedness, and just like we're if you were lucky enough to get some funding, and go through that first round. Like, what do we do with that? Invested entirely in revenue and cut out the things that, maybe nice to haves in a different time, because it's going to be a little different in the next few years.
Fascinating. I think we're kind of out of time, but I would have loved to hear about like equipment financing, customer financing, partnerships, right? I think folks are being general because we're talking in general, but I think depending on your company, you want to look at where else you can get money and resources, or where you could share costs in a way that allows you to, with 12 months of runway, not need to plan to raise the next round in Q3. We're talking to a lot of founders who are doing exactly that. They're like, it'll take 6 months and I'll raise it, or 3 months and I'll raise it. I'm like, but it could take you a year if you raise it. I'm sure if some of you who've seen that, it's been really tough. I think we have time for one question from the audience, maybe two, please. Ajay?
Ajay from Ingreto AI. Thanks for the amazing insights. I had a question for all of you. What are you guys excited about investing in right now in terms of areas, technologies, anything that excites you?
Lightning round. I mean, I would go to the example that I gave earlier of using LLMs to pull some insights around environmental data and biodiversity to help core customers solve some problems. So we've been talking with groups, for example, that do like land transaction decision-making support, and being able to offer whole insight out of the breadth of environmental data when, this very key moment where timberland changes hands. I mean, that's a really important fate for that area of land, like what's going to happen next to it. And so being able to provide the insights and tooling to be able to get the highest and best use, that's also the highest and best like ecological and climate use out of that land, and provide value for those buyers. All of that, we've had so much data now for so long that being able to hear what the customer needs, really, really understand them, and then pull that thread out using AI and package that as a service, I think we're just going to see compounding value over a long time.
Seed Strappable Climate Stars. And thank you for not introducing it to me, but maybe some of you that wasn't in your lexicon. But that's a huge benefit, learning that this is actually a real trend, a real phenomena. As an investor, I'm motivated to figure out how to make my venture model work with the concept of Seed Strat. It makes all the sense in the world. De-risk this whole, I'm going to do these things and I'm going to get a Series A. Just, good luck in this environment, at least. And if you can do all of the above as far as growth, and then eventually an exit with just having raised a seed round, the option is still always there to raise subsequent rounds. But, again, always going to have the climate tech filter, but definitely always looking at best practices in company building. And so that's my main filter, is like, have you figured out the most modern way to build the fastest company to get your solution that needs to exist out into the world?
I have no money to invest.
That will.
I think we need to wrap. So thanks, folks. I think people might be around for a couple minutes if you want to talk member. Thanks for being here.